Mr. Chairperson, Ambassador Surendra Kumar did not hide his dislike of television debates. But the way he has organized this panel discussion, crowding it with so many speakers and imposing a time limit, it's obvious that he's trying to replicate a television debate here. And I'll have to speak telegraphically, but it's a important subject. I'll focus on the U.S.-India strategic partnership. But I'll focus on the security aspects, not so much on the economic aspects, because the strategic partnership is both economic and security in terms of its components, because the economic aspects have already been covered. Three elements drive this partnership: money, military hardware, and Asian geopolitics. For the US, India's large and growing consumer market and India's import dependency on arms serve as a powerful magnet. For India, bandwagoning with the world's sole superpower holds important geostrategic benefits. The mutual optimism and excitement that we saw in the heady years of 2005 and 2006, after the nuclear deal and the defense framework agreement were unveiled, that mutual optimism and excitement have given way to more mature and more realistic assessments. In fact, even to some harsh assessments about the direction of the US-India relationship. Some in Washington, in fact, a growing number of analysts in Washington, portray the relationship as being oversold and adrift, accusing India of not fully opening up its market to American companies and still clinging to the old ideology of non-alignment and thus being overprotective of its strategic autonomy. For some in India, the larger geopolitical convergence internationally between the US and India has not helped narrow the divergence on regional issues that are of core interest to India. Yet, despite the mutual grievances, we cannot forget that there has been a major transformation in the relationship. And the first two elements that I mentioned, money and military hardware, their role is becoming increasingly evident. Dr. Gokan mentioned the US corporate penetration of the Indian market. But just looking at the two-way trade, how it has grown in the last 7 years, it has quadrupled from $25 billion in 2006 to about $100 billion this year. But even more impressive is the figure for US defense exports to India. In just one decade, they have grown from a measly $100 million to billions of dollars annually today. The strengths of the US-India strategic partnership are obvious, but not its infirmities. In fact, the infirmities tend to be glossed over in the public debate. And let me focus now on the infirmities so that you get a full picture of the strengths and the weaknesses. The infirmities actually are structural in nature. Because they're structural in nature, they have made the strategic partnership somewhat lopsided. And the structural limitations of this strategic partnership actually are rooted in India's own strategic limitations. In other words, India must shoulder much of the blame for this partnership not being more broad-based and for not being more balanced. The question that arises is whether India can pursue a more balanced and mutually beneficial strategic partnership with the United States, or for that matter with any other power, without being strategic in its own thinking and policy. Take defense transactions, the big success story of the past decade. These defense transactions are locking India as a perpetual client to patron the United States. There's virtually nothing that India can sell to the United States. It's a one-way relationship. Now, in comparison, if you look at America's relationship, strategic partnerships with two other Asian states, Japan and South Korea, which are spokes to the American hub in the US-led hub and spoke East Asian security order, these two countries, Japan and South Korea, have a pretty decent domestic armament production base, especially Japan. Japan can even co-develop advanced weapon systems with the United States. But India, unless India meets at least its basic defense needs indigenously, its strategic options will continue to be constrained. Another aspect about the strategic partnership is that, or about the defense partnership, is that the United States is now selling arms on both sides of the subcontinental divide without much of a fuss. Initially, there was concern in India that the Americans were selling arms to India and also to Pakistan, but now there's not much of a fuss. If there were a war between India and Pakistan, American origin weapons will be used by both combatants. It is therefore very paradoxical that India's outgoing ambassador to the United States, Nirupama Rao, recently, just a week ago, said, and I quote, that the armament business is the new frontier of Indo-US ties, and a very promising one at that, unquote. It is definitely a new frontier for the United States, which has displaced Russia as the single largest seller of arms to India. This is a remarkable success story for the United States. But for India, this is a new frontier of dependency. For the United States, the transformation of India as a leading arms client is a major diplomatic triumph. The last such acquisition of a major arms client by the US happened decades ago in the early 1970s when Egypt switched sides during the Cold War. From being dependent on Soviet arms supplies, Egypt became dependent on American arms supplies, a position where it is still today. A third facet of this strategic or slash defense relationship relates to the type of arms supplies by the US to India. From the heavy lift military transport aircraft to maritime reconnaissance planes that have been sold to India, these weapon supplies have proven very useful for the Indian military because they have helped to plug important gaps in India's defenses. But all these weapons fall by and large in the category of defensive weapon systems. The question that needs to be asked whether the US will be willing to sell offensive weapon systems to India, offensive weapon systems that will have relevance for India's defense preparedness vis-a-vis China. And by offensive weapon systems, I mean high precision conventional arms, anti-submarine warfare systems, long-range air and sea launched cruise missiles, and conventional counterforce systems. We don't know the answer because thus far the supplies to India that have been sold or contracted have been defensive weapon systems. If you look at the Soviet, the Russian Sukhoi strategic bomber, it's an offensive platform because it can carry out offensive missions and can penetrate an enemy's territory quite deeply. But Russia has also sold Sukhois to China. So the Americans are only emulating what the Russians have done. Another question that arises is whether in the discussion that Washington has been having with Beijing, and let us not forget that Beijing and Washington discuss South Asian issues periodically, whether the Americans have taken the Chinese into confidence and assured them that they are not going to be selling offensive weapon systems to India. Because the American arms supplies to Taiwan, the Chinese have been taken on board, they are in the loop. And if you look at the transfers to Taiwan, they're all defensive in nature. I don't have the time, but let me just conclude with one thought. The Americans are doing what they can to assertively promote their interests in India, in South Asia, and the larger Asia. And India needs to take a leaf from the American playbook. Diplomacy, to be effective, has to be backed by leverage and by cross linkages in trade and contracts so as to remove or at least reduce the disadvantages of the weaker side and to help build some equilibrium in the relationship. So the onus is on India to create that kind of leverage through its armament contracts, which are now running into billions of dollars annually, so that industries that are competitive in India, like the IT industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the kind of non-trade barriers that these industries are facing, leveraging those arms contracts to create better market access for competitive Indian industries has to be the task of Indian policymakers. Thank you.